The night Everett came home early from Calgary, he stood in the hallway of his own house for nearly 4 minutes before he said a single word. He had not announced himself. The flight had landed ahead of schedule, and he had told no one, not his assistant, not his driver, and certainly not his mother. He had simply wanted to walk through his own front door, set his bag down and find his wife Lena sitting somewhere warm and quiet, maybe with her feet up the way the doctor had told her to rest. What he found instead was his mother's voice. Harriet Vane had a particular register she used when she believed no one important was listening. It was not a shout, it was something worse, low and deliberate, each word measured out like a sentence being handed down. "You understand that this is not your home," she was saying. "You are here because my son has a misguided sense of obligation. That is the only reason. You have never belonged here and you never will." Everett stood at the edge of the kitchen doorway. Through the gap he could see his wife's profile. Lena Vane. Still legally Lena Hargrove in some parts of her heart, he suspected, was standing at the kitchen counter with both hands resting on the marble, her shoulders drawn in, her face turned slightly away from his mother. She was 7 months pregnant. She was wearing the gray cardigan he had bought her in Victoria because she'd said the fabric was soft enough to sleep in. And she was not crying. She was doing something harder than crying. She was enduring. "I heard you the first time," Lena said quietly. "Then act like it," his mother said. Everett should have walked in then. He would spend a long time afterward. Weeks if he was honest, asking himself why he did not. Part of it was shock. Part of it was something more shameful. The old reflex of a man who had grown up navigating his mother's moods the way you navigate a cracked floorboard. Carefully, silently, never directly. He let 4 minutes pass. And in those 4 minutes, he learned more about his own home than he had in 8 months of living in it. Harriet Vane had moved in 6 weeks after the wedding. That was the part Everett still struggled to explain, even to himself. He had not planned it. He had not offered. But his mother had called him on a Tuesday in November. Calm, measured, perfectly reasonable. And told him that the condo in Westmount had become unmanageable since his father's death. That the upkeep was too much. That she didn't want to trouble him, but there was always a but with Harriet. He had spoken to Lena that same evening. He remembered the way she had looked up from the book she was reading, and the careful pause before she said, "Of course, Everett, it's your mother, of course she can stay with us." He had loved her for that pause. He had not understood then what it cost her. His mother arrived with 2 suitcases and a set of opinions about the kitchen, that she distributed freely and continuously from the first morning. She had views on where the coffee should be stored, and how the cleaning schedule should run, and whether the guest rooms should be repainted before the holidays. She was not rude about it exactly. She was the kind of woman whose rudeness wore the costume of helpfulness so well that you had to watch for years before you saw the seam. Lena had said nothing. That was the thing Everett could not reconcile. Now that he was standing in his own hallway with his bag still in his hand and the truth settling over him like cold water. His wife had said nothing. She had smiled at his mother's suggestions and nodded at his mother's observations, and made room in their life for a woman who, it was now clear, had never once made room for her in return. He had thought it was going well. He had told his colleague Marcus, over lunch in February, "They're getting along better than I expected." He had said it with genuine relief. He had believed it. Standing in the hallway now, he understood that what he had mistaken for peace was his wife's silence, and his wife's silence had not been peace. It had been protection. For him, not for herself. He did walk in, eventually. Until his mother's footsteps moved toward the far end of the kitchen, and then he came through the door the way a man comes into a room he no longer feels entirely certain belongs to him. Lena turned at the sound. Her face changed. Something opened in it, some relief she had been keeping pressed flat, and then because she was Lena she smoothed it back almost immediately. "You're home early," she said. "Flight came in ahead of schedule." He set his bag on the chair by the door. "How are you feeling?" "Fine." Her hand went to the side of her belly, the unconscious gesture she made a dozen times a day. "We're fine." His mother appeared from around the kitchen island. "Everett." She looked pleased to see him, genuinely pleased, in the way that only someone who has never questioned their own welcome ever looks pleased. "You didn't call ahead?" "No," he said. "I didn't." Something in his voice must have shifted because his mother's expression flickered, just for a moment, just a small recalibration, before she settled back into her usual warmth. "Well, dinner isn't until 7, you have time to freshen up." He looked at his wife. Lena was looking at the window. "Actually," he said, "I'd like to talk to you, Mum, after dinner." His mother smiled. "Of course, darling." He spent the hours before dinner being very quiet and very attentive, and nobody in that house was entirely comfortable. He had married Lena Hargrove 3 years ago in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside of Kelowna, that she had found in a travel magazine and pointed at without irony and said that one. He had loved her for that too, for the directness of it, for the lack of performance. Lena did not perform. She was a woman who said what she meant and meant what she said and had very little patience for social architecture, which was perhaps why she had never been able to fully decode his mother, who was built almost entirely of it. Lena's own mother had died when Lena was 22. A sudden thing, a cardiac event, the kind of loss that rewrites a person's relationship with time. She had one brother in Nova Scotia and a small cluster of friends in the city, and she had come into his family with both hands open. The way people do when they haven't had family to protect for a long time and have almost forgotten to guard against it. His mother had seen this. Everett understood that now. He understood it with the particular nausea of a man who has slowly realized that something predatory happened in a room he thought was safe. While he was away on business. While he was telling colleagues over lunch that things were going better than expected. After dinner, which was quiet in a way that strained the word quiet past its usual meaning, he sat across from his mother in the sunroom and said, "How long has this been going on?" His mother looked at him with great patience. "How long has what been going on?" "I heard you," he said. "I was in the hall. I heard what you said to Lena." A small shift. His mother set down her tea. "I was trying to help her understand." "Understand what?" "That this house runs a certain way, that there are expectations." "She's my wife," Everett said. The words came out more quietly than he intended, which somehow made them more final. "She's carrying my child, and you told her she doesn't belong here." His mother's jaw tightened. "I said what needed to be said. It will not be said again." He met her eyes. "I need you to understand that clearly and completely. It will not be said again." His mother looked at him for a long moment. And then she said something that changed the shape of the evening entirely. "You don't know what Lena has been hiding from you," she said. "You don't know who her mother was." He had grown up hearing the name Hargrove only once, in passing, in a conversation between his parents that he had not been meant to overhear. He was 11 or 12, standing outside his father's study, and his father had said, "Patricia Hargrove kept her end of it, Harriet. Leave it alone." And his mother had said something low and sharp that he had not caught, and the door had been pulled almost closed, and he had walked away and forgotten about it entirely for 25 years. Patricia Hargrove had been Lena's mother. That was the thing he had not known. He had known that Lena's mother had died years before they met. He had known her name only from a single framed photograph on Lena's bookshelf. A woman with dark hair and careful eyes and a look of someone who had learned to hold her ground quietly. He had not asked about her often. It had felt like pressing on a wound that had mostly healed. He had not known there was anything to ask. What he learned that night, in fragments from his mother, in a conversation that kept stopping and restarting like a car in cold weather, was that Patricia Hargrove had not always been just Lena's mother. 30 years ago, Patricia Hargrove and his father, Edmund Vane, had been business partners. This was before Everett was born, when his father was still building what would become the Vane Group, a property development company that now managed 14 commercial properties across Ontario and Quebec. Patricia Hargrove had put in capital in those early years, and her name had been on the original partnership agreement. And when the company had grown beyond anyone's early projections, that agreement had quietly ceased to be mentioned. His mother had been the one to ensure it stopped being mentioned. "She signed a release," his mother said. "She was compensated." "Was she?" Everett said. A pause. "She signed a release. That isn't the same thing." He looked at his mother's face, really looked, the way he had not looked in years, because it is difficult to look clearly at someone you have loved without conditions since childhood, and he saw something he recognized from depositions and boardrooms, and difficult conversations across polished tables. He saw a woman who had been managing a story for a very long time, and had grown so accustomed to managing it that she had almost stopped knowing it was a story. Patricia Hargrove had signed something. That much was probably true. Whether she had signed it with full knowledge of what she was releasing, whether she had been given a fair account of what the company was worth at the time she signed, whether she had signed it in the aftermath of grief or financial pressure, or some other circumstance that Everett's mother had found convenient. These were questions that his mother's face, even now, was not answering. What it meant. What Everett sat with very still, in the sunroom his mother had repainted without asking anyone, was that Lena's mother had helped build the company that had built this house, and Lena had come into this marriage with no knowledge of it, and his mother had known all along. "She never told you," his mother said. It wasn't quite a question. "Lena doesn't know," Everett said, "does she?" His mother picked up her tea again. "It was a long time ago that," Everett said slowly, "is not an answer." He found Lena in the bedroom, sitting up against the headboard with a book she was not reading. He had come to know her non-reading face very well over 3 years. The particular quality of stillness, the way her eyes stayed on a fixed point somewhere in the middle distance. He sat on the edge of the bed. For a moment he just looked at her profile, the slight curve of her belly beneath the duvet, the way she was holding the book like a prop she had forgotten she was holding. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I need you to know before I say it, that I didn't know. I want to be clear about that. I understand that you have no particular reason to believe me right now, and I'm not asking you to. I'm just telling you." Lena set the book down. Her face was entirely still in the way that meant she was bracing. He told her everything. It took a while. He tried to be careful with the sequence of it, not to editorialize, not to fill in the parts he wasn't certain of with guesses. And he watched her face as he spoke, watching for the moment it landed. It landed somewhere in the middle, when he said his father's name alongside her mother's. Something shifted in Lena's expression, a recognition, not of the information itself, but of a shape she had sensed for a long time without knowing what it was. The off-register comfort of his mother always. The way Harriet Vane had looked at her sometimes. Not with dislike exactly, but with something complicated behind the dislike. The fact that she had never felt in this house. That her presence was entirely accidental to anyone but herself. Patricia Hargrove, Lena said quietly, and it was strange to hear her say her own mother's name that way, formally, with the distance of someone processing new information about a known subject. Yes, she was a partner. In the early company, yes. Lena was quiet for a long time. Then she said she never talked about it. We didn't have much growing up. She worked hard and she was careful with money, but we didn't have much. A pause. I always thought it was just how things were, her circumstances. Everett nodded. He didn't speak. He had learned over 3 years that there were moments when his wife needed room to think out loud, and that the best thing he could do in those moments was stay very still and very present, and not try to fill the space. What did she sign? Lena said. I don't know yet. I'm going to find out, Everett. She looked at him directly for the first time since he had come into the room. Was she pressured? He held her gaze. I don't know, I think it's possible. I think my mother knows more than she's said. Lena nodded once slowly. And then she did something he had not expected. She reached out and put her hand over his on the duvet between them, and she squeezed once briefly and said, Thank you for telling me. He looked down at her hand on his and felt the specific uncomfortable weight of a man who has been given grace he isn't certain he has earned. I'm sorry, he said, for not seeing it sooner. You didn't know what to look for, she said. And then quieter, neither did I. He called his solicitor the next morning at 7:30. The call lasted 40 minutes. By 9 o'clock he had made 2 other calls, to people who had known his father in the early years of the Vane Group and who, when asked carefully and directly, did not seem entirely surprised by the question. By 10 o'clock he had driven to his mother's end of the house. She occupied the east wing, with her own sitting room and bathroom, an arrangement that had seemed generous 8 months ago and now seemed more accurately like a very well-maintained mistake, and knocked on her door. His mother answered in her dressing gown, which meant she had been awake for hours. She looked at his face and said nothing. I've been making calls, he said. And I'm going to continue making them, and at some point, probably soon, I'm going to know exactly what happened to Patricia Hargrove's share of the partnership. But I'm asking you now, before that happens, because you are my mother and I would rather hear it from you. Harriet Vane looked at her son for a long moment. He waited. Your father loved the company, she said finally. That's not an excuse, I'm not offering it as one. But you have to understand what it was at the time. It was everything, and Patricia, she was not. She wasn't wrong to be there at the beginning. She was smart and she worked hard and her money was good money. But when the company grew, when it became something real, your father and I made choices about how it should be structured. Patricia had a claim, a legal claim, and she stopped. You negotiated her out, Everett said. We made sure the negotiation went our way, his mother said, and for the first time in the conversation she looked something other than composed. She looked tired. She was offered a settlement. It was below value. We both knew it was below value, and she signed it. Why did she sign it? A long silence. She was on her own. Lena was 9. She needed the money in hand, not tied up in a fight. His mother's voice had changed. Something had gone out of it or come into it, he couldn't tell which. She wasn't in a position to fight us, so you made sure she couldn't. His mother said nothing. He stood in the doorway of the room she had made her own. The photographs she had brought from Westmount arranged on the mantel. The curtains she had replaced without asking. And he said, I need you to think very carefully, Mum, about what happens next. Because Lena is going to find out the full picture. And so am I. And when that happens, I would rather that you had told us yourself than that we had to piece it together from paperwork. He left her there. He did not slam the door. The following weeks were not simple. Nothing about it was simple, and he would not pretend it was. There were lawyers and documents and a conversation with his mother that took 3 separate sessions across 8 days, before she finally told the full version. Not because she was deliberately obstructing, he thought, but because the full version required her to look at something she had spent 30 years arranging not to look at. That takes time even when you have decided to do it. What emerged when all the pieces were arranged was this. Patricia Hargrove's signature on the release had been obtained at a moment of particular vulnerability. She had been in debt, a fact she had not shared publicly, a fact that Harriet had been aware of and had used as leverage. Not cruelly, not openly, but with the quiet efficiency of a woman who knew exactly what another person needed and withheld it until the papers were signed. The settlement had been 40 cents on the dollar. The company had gone on to be worth many times what either of them had imagined. Patricia Hargrove had died with a small savings account and a condo she owned outright and her daughter's love, and she had never told her daughter any of it. Everett thought about that a great deal. He thought about what it cost Patricia to keep that secret. Not the money, but the silence. To watch her daughter grow up and then meet a man and fall in love and come into a house without knowing that her feet were touching ground her mother had helped build. He thought about the kind of dignity that takes and the kind of grief, and he found that he could not think about it for very long at a stretch. Lena for her part dealt with it the way she dealt with most things. Steadily, with her feelings at a slight remove until she was ready to let them close. She cried once. In the kitchen on a Sunday morning when she was making coffee and Everett came downstairs and found her with both hands on the counter, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking without sound. He went to her and put his arms around her from behind, his hands over hers, and she leaned back into him and let herself cry properly, with sound for a little while. When it was over she straightened up and said, "She would have hated for me to make it about the money." "I know," he said. "But it's not really about the money," she said. "It's about the fact that she spent 20 years believing she wasn't worth fighting for." He pressed his lips to the side of her head and did not trust himself to speak. Harriet Vane left the house on a Wednesday morning in early April, 3 weeks before Lena's due date. It was not an explosion. It was not a dramatic confrontation in a foyer with a suitcase at the door and accusations ricocheting off marble floors. It was quieter than that, and in some ways worse. Everett had found her an apartment in Westmount. Better than the one she had left, larger on a higher floor with a view of the park she had always said she preferred to the garden. He had arranged it without anger, and without coldness which had taken more from him than either. When he told her he said, "This is not punishment, I need you to understand that. But I also need you to understand that this is what has to happen, and that it is final." His mother had nodded. She had been, since their conversation in the East Wing doorway, different. Not broken, not reformed, not suddenly remorseful in the theatrical way of someone who has only just discovered consequences. She was simply quieter. As though she had put something down. She had asked, the morning she left, if she could see Lena before she went. He had said he would ask. Lena had thought about it for a day. Then she had come downstairs and sat across from Harriet Vane at the kitchen table and said, in a voice that carried no warmth but also, notably, no cruelty, "I want you to know that I don't hate you. I spent a long time feeling like I had to decide whether I did, and I've decided I don't. My mother made her own choices. So did you. I can't unknow what I know, and I'm not going to pretend it doesn't matter. But I'm not going to hate you either, because I think it would cost me more than it would cost you." Harriet Vane had looked at Lena for a moment and then looked away, and had not said anything that could be called a response. She had nodded, once. That was all. She had left with her photographs and her curtains, and her very particular opinions about how the coffee should be stored, and the house had been, for the first time in 8 months, simply theirs. The baby was born on a Friday evening in late April, in a hospital in the East End of Montreal, that smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, and the particular anxious energy of people who are waiting to learn which version of the day they're going to remember. She was a girl. They had known this, but knowing and seeing are not the same country. Everett sat in the chair beside the bed with his daughter in his arms. She was 3 hours old, and she had already made her position on being held very clear, which was that she required it constantly, and watched Lena sleeping the deep, unambiguous sleep of someone who has just done something enormous and earned the rest that follows. He had named the baby with Lena weeks ago, going back and forth over a list that was written in the Notes app on her phone and argued over during long walks along the canal. They had landed on a name and then briefly unlanded on it and then returned to it. It was the right name. He would tell the story eventually. Not all of it at once, it was too long for all at once. But in the way that stories get told in families, gradually over years in the car and at dinner and in the idle spaces between other things. He would tell his daughter that her grandmother Patricia had been a woman who believed in the value of things before other people knew to believe in them. He would tell her that her mother was someone who had handled an unfair thing with more grace than it deserved. He would tell her too about his own failures. The ones of attention, of assumption, of not seeing what was in front of him until he could not avoid it. Because he thought it was important for her to know that her father was not a man who had always gotten things right but was trying honestly and somewhat late to be a man who learned. Lena stirred, her eyes opened and found him in the dim room, and she smiled, the small private smile she had, the one that wasn't for anyone else. "How is she?" Lena said, opinionated. Everett said, "I think she gets it from you. She gets it from both of us. I'll accept a portion of it." He looked down at the baby's face, the startling realness of it, the fact of her, and said quietly, "She looks a little like your mother." Lena was quiet for a moment. He looked up and saw that she was looking at the ceiling. "I know," she said. "I noticed that right away." He stood carefully, so as not to disturb the bundle in his arms, and crossed the small space between them, and sat on the edge of the bed, and they stayed like that for a while, the three of them in the lit window of a Friday evening, with the rest of it still ahead of them, and the worst of it finally behind.